I'll go slow so you can go get it and come back and join us on YouTube if you need to. Was there anybody who took up the challenge from a couple of weeks ago and decided to write your own Proverbs? I should have sent a reminder somehow, but there's always the student. If you say, I might do such and such next class, there's always a student who does that, and then we'll hold you to it if you don't remember to bring it up. So this is just a formality, really. It's like the end of the pharmaceutical announcement where it tells you that it might kill you. But just checking. Just checking before. Okay, let's just go on then. Just by way of review, here's some important principles we've learned along the way. Wisdom is skillfulness in the wise Creator's ways. It's not just knowing things, but it's knowing which things, it's knowing the way the world works, it's knowing different kinds of people. As Dr. Swain said 2 weeks ago, there's a way to stroke a cat, and wisdom is knowing the way to stroke the cat, the way to live life along the grain of the universe, because the masterful and wise Creator is the source of wisdom. We also know from the very first chapter that the fear of the Lord is the prerequisite in the school of wisdom. That wisdom is never something we get and then use for our own devices and desires, but rather wisdom is always something that it must be pursued and practiced in relationship to the infinite personal God, as Francis Schaeffer would refer to, the infinite personal God of the Bible. That wisdom is never divorced from the relationship to the generous and benevolent, faithful Creator. And as we go through Proverbs, we've learned this, that the righteous bless others, even at their own expense, if necessary, because the wise bless the community. They are a tree of life, chapter 10 says. On the other hand, the wicked are trying to get ahead at the expense of others. The wicked enrich themselves at others' expense. And then, so those are the review principles. Before we look at a few, so what I'm going to do the rest of our time, we're going to look at a few specifics in this section, chapters 25 through 29. But then I want to come back to the beginning of the section, particularly verses 2 and 3, where it talks about kings. So, tastings. This is along the mollusk-consuming motif of the morning that we've already set. You can see from the handout, the first tasting, if you will, the first sampling of these Proverbs in 25 through 29, at least on your sheet. By the way, on the back side of your handout is a complete outline of this section, primarily from Bruce Walke's shorter commentary. And the reason I did that in the back, as I said from the beginning in this class, that one of the principal goals is for you to become wise readers of Proverbs. Not for you to come and have a wonderful Sunday school class where you can go home and then bask in the afterglow. And then, in fact, I'm doing my best to keep that from happening. Thanks, Bob. Because, frankly, that's so easy for us to do at church, right? We come and have a wonderful, impactful kind of, whether it's a sermon or the music, but then what we're taught and believe never gets democratized into our lives. And so that backside is for those of you who are taking seriously that challenge to become readers of wisdom, readers of Proverbs, because an outline helps you know where you are on the map when you're reading a particular proverb. But our tastings this morning, let's just begin. In chapter 25, verses 6 through 7, do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. I paraphrase this, and these are my paraphrases. Let others toot your horn. Because our natural tendency is to toot our own horns, right? And say if you're in the workplace or if you're in a classroom, there are others who are tooting their own horns, right? And so you know they're not as good tutors as you are. So it's very hard to not play your own horn, to not promote yourself in the presence of others who are self-promoting, but who are less worthy. In fact, later on, jealousy comes up as a subject, and Shakespeare called jealousy what? The green-eyed monster, because jealousy then tips things over into a whole different level of things. So often our integrity becomes vulnerable when we feel like we're not getting our due, or that others aren't noticing our talent. This is one of the basic lessons of helping your children through children's sports, because the coaches never know how good our children are, and therefore people don't want to coach youth sports because of that. But it's true in the workplace as well. It's hard. It comes up again in verse 17. Let's just look at 27, 1 and 2. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. Let another praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. I worked for a family business where the third generation son, became the president. But first he went away and succeeded on his own. I was on staff at a large church when I was in seminary, and they were looking for 2 assistant pastors when I was graduating, and the senior pastor told them they couldn't interview me because I had places to go and things to do. It really upset me at the time. But I learned later that because I worked and served with people who didn't know me, who weren't related to me, who would measure me according to a sound measure, that it actually made me better. And so this has a lot of relevance in our work lives, in our recreational lives, in our educational lives. But it takes trust in something. If you believe in the end justice will prevail, whether it's in the long term or ultimate term, if you believe that, you believe in God's providence, you believe in His providential care, and you believe the world works the way God has made it to be, and you believe God's going to work things out. And so walking by faith means, to a great extent, walking by God's providence. It doesn't mean being fatalistic, because the Proverbs exhorts us to all kinds of actions. And it doesn't preclude, if you're a salesperson, your job is to tell your potential customers the quality of your product, or if you're selling yourself in services, you do the same. But when our self-promotion causes us to exceed our works, exceed our accomplishments, we end up being motivated by jealousy and other things. On Thursday, where's Kent? I was at the Lyle Lovett concert on Thursday night. Anybody else? No, I didn't expect there would be. But Lyle Lovett told a story of a very well-known folk musician at the New Braunfels Folk Festival one year. There was a young guy who kept chasing this very accomplished musician around, wanting to play the fiddle for him to show how good he was. And all day, this young guy dogged this senior, older, accomplished musician, until finally, at the very end of the day, as this older man was getting ready to get on the bus, and this young guy came up to him once again, he said, okay, play me a lick or two. And the young guy played a lick or two. And then the older man said to him, according to Lyle Lovett, here's what you do. Go home and practice for a week, and then quit. Because he was so self-promoting that his goods were well short of all his promises. So there's a tempering ambition with accomplishment Or as the New Testament, or in James tells us, I will show you my faith by my works. So, that's let others toot your horn. Luke 14 has a parable or an exhortation from Jesus about don't take the most important seat at the table, but instead take the least, and you'll have a better chance of being invited up as opposed to being invited to move down. Next, settle things between yourselves when possible. In the last part of verse 7 of chapter 25, what your eyes have seen, do not hastily bring into court. For what will you do in the end when your neighbor puts you to shame? Argue your case with your neighbor himself, and do not reveal another's secret, lest he who hears you bring shame upon you, and your ill repute have no end. You know, the basic gist here is try to solve problems between ourselves before we appeal to authorities. When we call somebody out in public, does that improve the prospects of resolution? Not very often. But because you've added now shame to justice. And when shame gets layered onto justice, justice gets obscured. And so I was talking to somebody just before Sunday school this morning about a matter that was required interpersonal communication, but it wasn't handled that way initially, and that made resolution more difficult. When I was a denominational executive, I got sued. Our medical plan got sued. It was over about $130,000 bill, and we got sued for $24 million. That about right, Rich? That's about the ratio that works in there. And so we went through all these depositions. I got kicked in the shin by my lawyers during depositions, and learned it's important what you don't say, it's what you do say. And finally there was a hearing before a judge, and the judge looked at things and said, you guys, he said to the plaintiff attorney, he said, you get out of here and you go settle this. Don't come here with this. If I have to decide this, you won't be happy. And the judge was wise, and we ended up in a mediator's office, and there was an equitable resolution of the matter. But it's hard to bill hours by settling. You don't get many billable hours when you settle things early and often up front, directly with people. And that's what the mediator said to us. He kept pointing over to the courthouse, and he kept saying, now, you don't want to go over there. That judge, he's a good judge, but he knew nothing about medical insurance. And he was right. Everybody knew he was right. And that was we were happy about settling it that way. But the New Testament says the same thing, doesn't it? If you have a dispute with a brother or sister, Matthew 18, what do? Well, you go try to resolve it. Now, one of the infamous misapplications of Matthew 18 is when it has to do with misdeeds, particularly in church leadership. Matthew 18 has nothing to do with that. When people who are accountable for the souls of others do things that speak to their qualification for being in ministry, Matthew 18 is sometimes invoked as a way of just, you have to keep quiet about this. That has nothing to do with this. Matthew 18 is about interpersonal disputes, trying to settle matters that should be settled between people. And Paul's words to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 are also words that speak to this. If I read from verse 14, remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Eventually, Paul says in verse 24, the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. In a verbal exchange, if you don't hit the ball back over the net, there's a better chance of the exchange being resolved better. The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, with the hope that it might bring elicit repentance. And this is difficult. I said this in a sermon a few years ago, and there was actually a representative of our local NBA franchise there. I said, the kingdom of God is much more like Major League Baseball than NBA. And I didn't know somebody from the Magic was in the congregation at the time. But the fact is, even if you watch all professional sports, they're tilted more and more over the last number of decades toward confrontation, and and people go to a fight to see if a hockey game will break out. But it's true. It's increasingly true in every sporting arena, because to not talk trash and to not be pugilistic in our words is to be soft or to be weak. And in fact, Paul is saying here, strength actually is in patience, because there's a prospect of resolution. Often it's not answering that gives a person the opportunity to think and reflect before they feel they have to defend themselves. So it's a very practical advice here. The next one, don't swat a mosquito with a sledgehammer when it comes to words. Verse 11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver, like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Meaning, a wise reprover is, their words are precious to somebody who needs reproved. Verse 13, like the cold of snow in the time of harvest, if is a faithful messenger to those who send him, he refreshes the soul of his masters. Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of a gift he does not give. So verse 14 is sort of a contrast. The words not fitly spoken are empty of effect. Verse 15, with patience a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. It doesn't mean we're trying to break bones, but it's saying it's just a metaphor of contrast, that soft words are much more powerful than we realize, and can accomplish a great deal more than hard words. So don't squat a mosquito with a sledgehammer when it comes to words. The wise of speech understand not just words, but the wise of speech understand how words and people work and interact together, so that given the right persons and the right words, success is optimized. A fool doesn't listen to wise teaching. The fool is the hardened, we've read that before, the fool is hardened against good advice, and it takes a rod to get their attention. But when you use hard words, you're declaring that the person you're talking to is a fool. And when you make that judgment, first of all, you're saying there's no possibility of persuading the other person, but you're also probably making that judgment prematurely. By the way, in terms of all these things, The complement is also true. Don't be the person on the other end. While success is not entirely dependent upon us doing the right thing, failure is within our grasp. And so when there's a proverb that says, words don't convince a fool, one application is that to say we shouldn't try to convince fools with words. On the other hand, we should also say, Lord, is it I? Am I being unreprovable in a situation? And maybe I'm not really a fool in the full sense of what Proverbs is saying, but maybe I'm acting like one. Now, using wise words is not just about getting what we want, but using wise words is working toward what is wise and right. So we're not just reading advice, what's the Carnegie book? How to win friends and influence people. Proverbs have changed that title to How to Be a Friend and bring life, bring righteousness to people. Later in verse 25, or chapter 25, starting at verse 28, when possible, avoid fools. Like Mr. T said, what did Mr. T say? Thank you, Andrew. I pity the fool. Stay away from him. But when unavoidable, deal with them as fools. Whatever you do, don't encourage them in their folly. Where am I getting that? Well, verse 28 of chapter 25. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. He's completely unrestrained. Like snow in summer or rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. It doesn't have any effect. Like a sparrow in its flitting, like a swallow in its flying, a curse that is causeless does not alight. That is, when there's no justice or righteousness in words, they are to no effect. Verse 3, a whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, a rod for the back of fools. Now, you should laugh sometimes when you're reading Proverbs. You can picture Balaam on the donkey. You can picture Sancho Panza in Don Quixote, muddling along on his little burro. And so the fool is actually acting like an animal. And I think I may have said this a few weeks ago. There's this continuum. When people are the most like God, they're human, but when they're the least like God, they're described with animal terms, like when Nebuchadnezzar became like a grazing cow, or when, as Paul admonished the Galatians, that we bite and devour one another. We're doing things like a pack of dogs might do, and so we recognize the folly of acting like animals rather than like image bearers of God. So famously, verses 4 and 5, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Now, the popular interpretation of that is, do you answer a fool according to their folly? Well, it just depends. Dr. Walke says that's not exactly right, and I think he's correct. The first half of that, answer not a fool according to his folly. Don't answer a fool in fool's terms. Don't accept the premise or the mode of discourse or the categories of what's right and wrong and true and false. Don't accept the terms of a fool in order to answer them, but you do answer them. You address them on terms of wisdom, on terms of justice and righteousness. So this is not an either-or thing, but it's an imperative for all situations in which we are presented with folly. Perhaps a little different. And there are a couple of others that have popular understandings that aren't quite right, and I'll comment on a few more of those. In chapter 26, next we have sluggards and wealth. Chapter 26, verse 13. The sluggard says, "There's a lion in the road, there's a lion in the streets." I said it the way you're supposed to hear it when you read it. Like alarmist, overreactive. Verse 14. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. If you just kind of, rolling over, it's like the most energy exerted in a day is going from the left side to the right side to sleep on. 15. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. It wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. Now, if you've ever seen a toddler fall asleep with a popsicle in their hand, I mean, that's cute. But it's not cute with grown-ups. And so the sluggard, it's just like maybe waiting for somebody to put his hand back to his mouth. And that's why I brought this book, Dr. Cole. Dr. Cole and I waste probably 15 minutes every morning talking to him about books and BBC murder mysteries. And we both really like it. It's Confederacy of Dunces, John Kennedy Toole's well-acclaimed novel. It's not for everyone, but Ignatius J. Riley is about the best sluggard in literature I can ever imagine. Zach, can you think of a better one? No, I mean he's just a cultivated sluggardness. He at one point he can't keep a job, but he's got high-flown ideas about his intellectual life and his ideals. And he finally lands a job peddling a hot dog cart. This is all set in New Orleans. And he's peddling a hot dog cart, but he gets so hungry. He gets so hungry peddling the cart. And it's so hot and hard to pedal that he eats all the hot dogs. So that's Ignatius J. Riley. And are there others that you can think of in literature that are just wonderful images of? Anyway, he comes. Yes, Randy. Oh, Bartleby the Scrivener. Oh my gosh, yeah. Bartleby, nobody really does. He doesn't do his job. So nobody does what he does. And the end, if I recall, the end is that they keep changing his job. This is like a Dilbert cartoon, by the way. They keep changing his job description until he's not doing anything. But then he quits going home to sleep and eat, and so they finally just move the whole law practice. Because they don't know how to get him out of there. I mean, this is like the slugger. Yeah, excellent example. But on Bartleby the Scrivener, Dickens. Yeah. But you who manage people at work, you've no doubt, if you've worked with people in management roles, undoubtedly you've had a Bartleby or Ignatius J. Riley somewhere along the way, and there's no reproving the committed fool, but you sometimes you recognize they are simple and still open to instruction. In verse 17 and following, you've got three different kinds of people to watch out for: meddlers, the mischievous, and maligners. I'm not going to take time for specific comments on that. In chapter 27, I mentioned jealousy earlier. Famously in verse 17, we have iron sharpens iron and one man sharpens another. And this is taken generally as a positive thing, which it is, but the image here is of forging a blade, the heavy hammer that hones the blade of a weapon. And so it's not a gentle image. Now, friends can be gentle toward one another, but at times a good friend is going to say things that are hurt because they're true and loving. So it does include that that image. In 27, we also have a interesting chain of liability in verses 13 through 16. I think I've got that out of place. Never mind. Let's look at verses 19 and following. Skipping taking care of business in verses 19 and following in chapter 28. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits will have plenty of poverty. A faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. In verse 22, a stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. And this is a pretty profound and broad concept for us. Again, it's dealing with the two big subjects of Proverbs, which is words and wealth. Words and wealth. And what it's saying here is how we get our wealth matters as much or more than the getting of it. And this presents itself constantly in our world. You're looking for something on Facebook Marketplace and you see the thing you need, and obviously the person is just trying to get rid of it. And maybe you figure out some way, or eBay, or just at a yard sale, you realize the person selling is desperate for money, and you know the true worth, and therefore you see an opportunity to take advantage of the person rather than to give them a fair price. We see this in business. We see it in larger business practices or distressed real estate, and it's difficult in a market economy where the way the market works has built-in advantage, disadvantage components to it. But when we are overtly taking advantage of somebody in hard straits and gaining, no matter what we do with what we gain, it doesn't sufficiently launder it if it's gotten at the disbenefit of someone else. And so it's right to ask these kind of questions in terms of investing, and we can't know everything. This gets into a complicated thing in a market economy where a lot of wealth is built in commodities and financial instruments. But there is a general responsibility to know and to exercise justice and righteousness in how we gain our wealth, because wealth gained unjustly leads away from generosity, but wealth gained justly leads toward generosity. And then finally, chapter 29, verse 18, before we do our last piece for the day. Where there is no prophetic vision, the people cast off restraint, but blessed is he who keeps the law. Now, that might sound unfamiliar because the previous translations say, without a vision, what? The people perish. And so that line has been extracted from its context in Proverbs and used to say, okay, our church, our organization needs to have a vision, and the vision becomes all-consuming. Now, visions are not bad. Did we call it a mission statement or a vision statement down at the beginning of every worship service? a vision. Yeah, so having a biblical vision is a good thing, but that's got nothing to do with what Proverbs 29, 18. And so the ESV corrects the misunderstanding. Where there is no prophetic vision, that is, where there is no word from God, the people cast off restraint. And you could tell the meaning in relation to the second line, but blessed is he who keeps the law. So keeping God's commands, walking by the light of his word is the way of wisdom and blessing. And so to ignore or to dismiss the word from God, because as you know, we know Jesus said, we live not by bread alone, but by every word from the mouth of God. So the last few minutes we have, I want to bring us back to chapter 20. Any questions or comments? I know the last issue I raised gets very complex, especially in our kind of a global financial economy, but we're obligated to figure it out at least. Yes.
When a proverb gives both sides of it, says to do this, and then it says the opposite, you should do that. The one-to-one example you wrote, is that called an antonym, or is there a different?
Well, I was saying in terms of answer a fool according to his folly, answer not. I was saying that's actually saying two different things, not saying opposite things. But there is, going back to earlier in the class, these antithetical parallels where it's saying the same thing but in opposite terms. Yeah. And you see more of that in the first set of Proverbs from Solomon. These Proverbs in 25 through 29 are a little different in terms of their form, but yeah. Well, let me just say a few things about the focal point here. The beginning, verses 2 and 3 say, "It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out." Now, if you don't sort that out, it's hard to navigate a lot of what else is said here. It is the glory of God to conceal things. The word for things there is actually a word that can be understood as word or thing. But what it's referring to is not that God hides from us, not that God hides wisdom from us, but rather wisdom is embedded in the grain of the universe. That where can you find wisdom? You look to the skies, you look to the plants. In fact, one thing Solomon was famous for was for his lectures or teachings on botany and zoology. Because the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament his handiwork. So the created order is where we see wisdom born out. So that's what that first line means. Where does God place wisdom? He has embedded it in the fabric of the universe. Then that second line, "But the glory of kings is to search things out." That is, the glory of kings is to look for wisdom, to gain wisdom, to discern wisdom, to understand people and practices and the way the universe works. So you see you have this wonderful symbiosis here. God is the source of all wisdom, and he has held it forth in the created order. And then God appoints a king who is the, if you will, the decoder or the translator or the teacher of wisdom. And that fits, doesn't it, with the whole book of Proverbs. Solomon is the wisest king, the wisest man who ever lived. And where did his wisdom come from? Well, it came from God. So he studied the way the world was in the fear of the Lord and in the light of God's commands, and then he communicated that wisdom to God's people. So that's verse 2. "So as the heavens for height and the earth for depths, so the heart of the king is unsearchable." That is, the king is getting his wisdom from the source of wisdom, and he is the one who translates and communicates that wisdom. Why is that relevant to us? Well, God, let's put it this way, God is unsourced light. We see that in the very beginning of the Bible. That God is not a created light. We see it in John 1. But that God is light in himself. And therefore, using that metaphor of light, the king is the one who seeks light, the one who seeks understanding. And Solomon is the paradigm for that in the Old Testament. I want to show us just a few Old Testament passages that speak to that. In 1 Kings 3, Solomon has this prayer for wisdom. He prays for an understanding mind. It literally a hearing heart to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. And God says, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding, discernment, to discern or hear what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. So Solomon, in the fear of the Lord, asked for divine wisdom, and was given it, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. That's 1 Kings 3. It goes on about Solomon's fame. It's in 3 and 4. After he decides the matter of the two women who are vying for the baby, you know that famous story. One's the mother, but one's not. And Solomon says that thing. It says, all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So that God, later it says, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people to the east, that would be in Mesopotamia, and all the wisdom of Egypt. And the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. And so God's wise king makes God famous with the wisdom that God gave Solomon. And he becomes, he excelled all the kings of earth in riches and wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom. And we won't take the time to look at it, but in Solomon's temple benediction, he furthers this notion. So Solomon is the paradigm of wisdom, and that fits with what we read in chapters 25, verses 1 and 2, that God is the one who has embedded wisdom in the created order. Solomon, requesting the gift of wisdom, discerns the wisdom of God and is famous for justice and equity, not just within Israel, but in all the earth. We know the Queen of Sheba, among others, came just to hear Solomon's wisdom. So the focus is on Solomon as the paradigm of wisdom in chapter 25, verses 2 and 3. But the story doesn't end there. And next week we'll actually talk more specifically about this in a different way. But Solomon is the paradigm, but Jesus Christ is the paragon of wisdom. Solomon is just a type, or someone who points forward to what Jesus would be like. We often think narrowly of who Jesus was and what he came to do. God become incarnate, he came to die for our sins, which is all very good, but it's way more than that. Jesus is the paragon of wisdom as our king. How is that so? Well, in John chapter 1, we're told that he is unsourced light. He is the light which enlightens everyone. That he does not receive his light from outside of himself as God the Son. You know, the sun, the moon, the stars, even the moral light of image bearers of God is all reflective light, right? It's sourced light. We look at the moon and we think the sun is somewhere over here. But when we look at the sun, we don't look for where that light's coming from because that light is coming from the sun itself. So Jesus, as the eternal Son, is unsourced light. And yet, at the same time, he is the mirror of divine light. Colossians 1:15 tells us this. He is the image of the invisible God. That is, he is not only unsourced light as eternal Son, but he's the perfect reflection of divine light as the incarnate one, as a human being. So in the divine human nature of Christ, we both have God who hides wisdom, and we have the human king who searches for God's wisdom. As such that Paul prays subsequently in Colossians that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which in Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures and the wisdom of God. Christ is all contained wisdom, and he is also the one who discerns and teaches wisdom, because he is going back to Colossians 1, he's the firstborn of all creation. As Dr. Swain talked about him as the one who was with God in the beginning. But he is also the firstborn from the dead. He's the new man in whom we have the wisdom and knowledge, the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Further, Paul says in Romans 16, and these are just selective samples, when Paul doxologizes the end of Romans, now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, the wisdom of God, but has now been disclosed through the prophetic writings, has been made known to all nations according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. To the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. The only wise God receives glory through Jesus Christ. And so Jesus is not just the eternal Son who is unsourced light, in whom the wisdom of God is embodied in its origin, in its source, but he's also the one who reveals the wisdom of God to us. The last text to look at before we sing is, it's a longer text, so I don't have it spelled out on the slide, but it's 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 11 through 21. Let me read it and comment. This is a section titled, Fight the Good Fight, in Paul's words to Timothy. But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, gentleness. That sounds like wisdom teaching. Fight the good fight of the faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called. Life, that's a wisdom thing. That's a Proverbs thing. And about which you made a good confession in the presence of many witnesses. I charge you in the presence of God, who gives life to all things, Proverbs, and of Jesus Christ, who in his testimony before Pontius Pilate made the good confession, to keep the commandment unstained and free from reproach until the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ, which he will display at the proper time. He who is the blessed and only sovereign, he is the unsourced light, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, who dwells unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. I'll leave off the reading there for the sake of time. But the point is that God still gives us a king. In fact, he's given us a better king. That the teaching of the Old Testament about the nature of good and evil kings is not something that expired with the Old Testament age. And thankfully we have God's anointed king, Jesus Christ, as our king. A whole other area we could explore is how God gives us that wisdom today, certainly through His Word, but this is why I'm a Presbyterian, among many things. We get our debts forgiven, not just our trespasses. Well, okay. Thanks, Bob. But the wisdom of God does not come to us through one person in a Presbyterian church. It comes to us through a group of people qualified by their character to know the wisdom of God. And so we have what we call a plurality of elders. We don't have kings in the in fact, many Scots Presbyterians died. 67,000 died at the hands of the English crown over one simple thing, and that only Jesus Christ is the head of the church. And God administers His sovereign, Christ administers His sovereign kingship through a group of people who are qualified according to the character that the Scriptures teach. But that's just another application of this. Today, I want to finish by singing. How many of you taught your children Judy Rogers songs? Anybody? Okay. This is just one song from a Judy Rogers album called Go to the Ant. You might guess that that's about the book of Proverbs. There's another song in there called The School of the Fool. And there's one called Isabella is a Pig. With a ring in her snout, you can dress Izzy up, but you can't take Izzy out. But anyway, that's Isabella's a Pig. And then there's a really beautiful, tender song called Talk to Me, in the child's voice, the mother talking to the child, the father talking to the child. But we're going to sing Seven Awful Things. It's about another passage in Proverbs we studied a couple weeks ago. We didn't really talk about it much. But if you know it, you're going to sing with me on the first verse. And then everybody's going to join in singing the first verse again. There are six things. Are you with me? We're going to sing it through a couple of times so you can learn it, and then we're just going to sing it like we mean it, like a Baptist, okay? There are six things, even seven, that the Lord hates, things He cannot stand. Proud-looking eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that thinks of wicked things to do, and feet that run to evil too. Anyone who loves to lie about others, and the one who causes trouble with his brothers. You have to do that ominous thing on the end line of each of these, okay? Let's go back and let's have fun singing this. It's got about 3 verses. There are 6 things, even 7, that the Lord hates, things He cannot stand. Proud-looking eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that thinks of wicked things to do, and feet that run to evil too. Anyone who loves to lie about others, and one who causes trouble with his brothers. God is love, we know that's true, but God hates things that we should hate too, like proud-looking eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that thinks of wicked things to do, and feet that run to evil too. Anyone who loves to lie about others, and the one who causes trouble with his brothers. There are 6 things, even 7, that the Lord hates, things He cannot stand. Proud-looking eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that thinks of wicked things to do, and feet that run to evil too. Anyone who loves to lie about others, and the one who causes trouble with his brothers. So if you have little ones in your life or somebody else's life, G. Rogers has tremendous resources of good children's music. My hope originally was that we would somehow bring the kids in to sing to us, but that was more complicated than probably anybody could get their mind around. But thank you. You're dismissed to worship.
Maybe his daughter, is a psychologist who works with corporate at the highest level.
Yes.